All right. Does anyone know where we are at this morning? All right, good start. That's a good start. Philippians, and we are in chapter 2, verses 12 through 18. And I fully suspect this section to take more than one class period, but that is the scope of our lesson for this morning, at the very least. Thank you so much for being here this morning, and I hope that you have been enjoying this study as much as I have. I know I've learned a lot, and I even just, I don't know if you would call it an epiphany this morning, but there's like this big outline that just came into my head about this whole section. I was like, oh, that might actually work. So I'll get to share that with you guys. Philippians 2, 12 through 18. Let's talk about where we're at and where we've been. Paul is writing to the congregation at Philippi, located in the Roman colony of Philippi, within the region of Macedonia. Paul is currently writing while under house arrest in Rome, and he's currently awaiting trial while under house arrest in Rome. At the end of Acts 28, we're told that he's in house arrest for around 2 years, and he seems to not be sure of his fate. He, as we talked about in chapter 1, verses 19 through 26, he's not sure whether he's going to make it out once he actually goes on trial before the emperor. And so keep that hesitant future in mind, though I believe there is reason to suspect he will make it out of this particular imprisonment, though he may not later by the time he writes the letters like 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus written at that later point under a different imprisonment. And in writing to the Philippian congregation, it seems that they're undergoing some type of persecution. It's hard to nail down from what exactly, or by who exactly they're being persecuted. We know that when Paul was in the city initially, it was the Roman officials that they were persecuted by. But we also know that this is a pagan city. There were Jews in the city as well. And so it could be a number of different reasons, but they do seem to be persecuted. And I don't know if I brought this up in previous times, but I think that is in part why the theme of rejoicing is so prevalent in this letter. Like you see constantly rejoice, rejoice, rejoice. And it's going to be brought up again today. And I think that's because they needed it. Like if you were going through some of the things that at least as they have been implied to have been going through, we're told in 1:7 they were sharing in chains in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. If they're being thrown in prison for this, yeah, they probably need some encouragement. And so maybe that's why there is so much a heavy emphasis on that. And speaking of 2:12 through 18, last week we had finished the God drama, the Christ hymn of 2:5 through 11. And what I would argue is really the center of this section, the core, and is what we really need to tie everything back to, especially this section, since this section is going to serve as the practical application of the theology that Paul just laid out. And in particular, he is going to emphasize the obedience. Christ was obedient to God, chapter 2 and verse 8, and therefore we must be obedient to Christ, submitting to his lordship, as we kind of emphasized towards the end of last week, being the primary thrust of that section. As we get into this section, Paul's going to transition back towards his own situation. And I believe once we get into verse 19, we're certainly entering a new section talking about Paul's companions with Timothy and Epaphroditus. And we're going to talk about them a little bit in the coming weeks. But he's going to bring this section to a close, and you're going to notice in this section he's going to bring a lot of these reoccurring themes back. It's going to be applied in a slightly different way because now we've actually gone through the Christ hymn, and he's going to revisit some of these subjects but from a different angle, which I think is really interesting. And you may be able to say he's starting to work backwards. If you like to draw in your Bibles or write your Bibles, maybe this is something you find interesting, but I believe there is a correlation between the different sections and maybe even a chiasm in the structure. Look at this. So if you notice 2:12 and 13, he's going to emphasize obedience. That's going to be his main thrust, as therefore as my beloved, as you was always obeyed. He's going to talk about working, and words for working are going to be present all through this section. Well, obedience was emphasized in 2:5 through 11. So it seems that at least on some extent, those sections are parallel, at least 5 through 8. But then if you look at 2:14, he's going to say, do all things without complaining and disputing. Well, that very much parallels to 2:1 through 4, because 2:1 through 4 was all about unity and humility. And so if 2:12 and 13 are parallel to 2:5 and 11, then 2:14 would be parallel to 2:1 through 4. That's your next stepping stone. Well, after that, if you look in verses 15 and 16, he's going to talk about their conduct, and specifically their conduct in relation to the rest of the world. He's going to say that you need to shine as lights to the world. Well, if you go back to 1:27 through 30, what is he talking about? He's talking about their relationship to the rest of the world, and specifically in how they need to deal with their adversaries. So maybe that's the next layer. And if you look at 2:17a and 1:27, both of them have the discussion of this is what you need to do whether I come back and visit you or not. And he says that very directly in both sections. Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs. Whether I come and actually visit you or I don't make it. Well, he's going to say something very similar at the end of verse 16. But I may have not run in vain or labored in vain. And yes, and if I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, we'll talk about what that means. But I believe the indication is if I don't make it, I don't want the things that I have done to go in vain. But if I do make it, regardless, I want you to be glad and rejoice, which if you look at 2:17b through 18, you have those themes of rejoicing, and 1:26, also rejoicing. And so you may notice as you look from 1:26 all the way to 2:18, you kind of have this pyramid effect of outward theme, these themes here, here, and then here. And if you look at the center, where does that bring us? It brings us to the Christ hymn, and specifically the exaltation of Jesus. That's why I believe that's the center of this section. It's the very center of Paul's writing in terms of his themes. And if you want to look even broader beyond that, we've noticed that 1:12 through 1:26 is talking about his personal life, the things that are going on with him. Well, if you look in 2:17 through 18, that's what he's talking about, the things that are going on with him. And so I think that this whole section works as one big unit with exaltation of Christ at the center of it. Okay? All right. That being said, what that means is that if we ever have some interpretive difficulties with this section, then we can go to that place on the other half of the staircase, and maybe that might help us out. That being said, Philippians 2:12 through 13. Sorry, one more thing I should mention. One more thing. Okay, you'll notice in this section, it's 3 sentences. 12 through 13 is a sentence, 14, 15, and 16 are a sentence, and then 17 and 18 are a sentence. And I believe all of those are imperatives, so again, commands, which is another thing we've seen a lot through this section, beginning at 127. Lots of commands, lots of imperatives. So it makes sense that we're ending it on the other side. Okay, as you were. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Okay, he starts off with the word therefore, which is evidently building on what we just talked about. So as I said, the practical application of the Christ hymn. Then he says, my beloved. It's a term of affection. He's calling back to the relationship that he has with the Philippians. He's visited them on multiple occasions, and he's bringing that to your mind. Philippians, you and I, we go way back. We know each other. And you can trust him about the say, is what he's saying by implication. Then he says, as you have always obeyed, likely since he first presented the gospel to them in Acts 16. And the word there is the idea of acting upon what was heard. And just think about this for a second. This would be a really awesome thing to have said about your congregation. You have always obeyed. Now, by implication, he may be saying there's something you need to work through right now, but to have been faithful for all that time is still noticeable nonetheless. They know what faithfulness looks like. Not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence. So once again, a very clear callback to 127. He's saying, whether I come and see you, or I don't make it, because he's about to go on trial and he doesn't know what his sentence is going to be, I want you to be faithful. So calling back to that theme. Now, question for you guys, why would he say much more in my absence? It's an interesting way of wording it. Sure.
In his absence, they have to rely on not only what he said, the way he acted, and the words that they get about him from other places and from the word itself.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So having Paul's presence there and his teaching and really his accountability, I mean, that's really helpful to have someone there in person. And I think more than that even, now that he's been gone for a little while, we hear about the struggles that they're facing now. They've had some new struggles. If we're really meaning persecution, yeah, that's something that they have to work through. And Paul's dealing with his own thing in Rome. Well, they're dealing with the same thing over in Macedonia. And according to 128, we're told that they're dealing with adversaries. And so since Paul's been gone, they've dealt with some stuff, and that has, in dealing with that has proved their faith in the sense that they've been able to overcome some of those hardships.
Also, we can realize that it's God working in them, not just him being there. Actually, it's God working in them.
Sure. And over time, maybe the fruits of that have been more pronounced. Okay. Now we get to the next phrase. Work out your own salvation. This is the primary verb, the primary imperative of the 2 verses. And let this be a lesson in your own study. So whenever I was going through and doing my study for this lesson, I had somehow missed the step of going and seeing what this particular word was rendered in other instances, particularly the word work out. And So I had gone to the commentaries and I had started reading, and I was like, oh, that's good. That's a good idea. And a lot of them presented the idea of working out unto completion, which I believe is an appropriate nuance of the word. You're working out what you already have. But then I actually ran the word in my Bible program, and I realized that's not the word at all. The word here is produce. It's the word create. And that's how the New Testament renders it basically every time. In fact, I don't think it rendered it work out any other time in the New Testament. This is the only time it renders it that. So I was like, okay, what's going on here? Literally, he's saying, produce your own salvation. And arguably, the word can have that emphasis of bringing to completion, which I believe it is an appropriate emphasis here because he's talking to Christians. He's talking to people that he recognizes are already saved. But that is what he says. Now, it is important to remember that the word salvation, soteria, can mean either salvation or deliverance. If you go back to 128, I believe that word was, salvation that we use there. Well, we kind of rendered that deliverance because it can be rendered that. But then we went down to verse 119 we rendered deliverance. 128 was rendered salvation. They're both the same word, but they can mean different things depending on the context. So, does it mean deliverance or spiritual salvation here? Well, that's where the structure becomes so important because we're mirroring 127 through 130 right now. So, therefore, if we're mirroring this section of Scripture, then it's much more likely we're talking about spiritual salvation. That's where our structure helps us out a little bit. And also, that's just the most basic meaning of the word in its unaffected sense. Okay. Putting this into practice and really looking back at verses 5 through 11, how do Christians produce their own salvation? Right. Obedience. And I think that's exactly what he's getting at. And that's especially what he's emphasizing in the next verse. And so it does raise the question, why would Paul tell a group of Christians to produce their own salvation? Aren't they already saved? Perhaps, and I believe that's where the nuance of bringing to completion, it's something they've already started. Now they have to live out their salvation. And the particular manifestation of the phrase, work out your salvation, is going to be brought out in the next couple verses when he says, do all things without complaining and disputing. For you, Philippians, that's what this phrase means. You need to get your act together within the congregation. He's telling him lovingly in doing that. He says, my beloved, but you need to get your act together. The underlying principle, though, I believe still stays the same. Man is making some contribution to his salvation. And whether the best analogy is one who works in order to get a job or one who works once they've got the job, it's hard to say, but I believe both involve work. And we're gonna clarify what that means in a little bit because you can misconstrue and really you can twist that into some very non-scriptural ways. But to say produce your own salvation, kind of like keep yourself in the love of God, that's what it says.
Where it says own salvation, is that individual or is that collective as the church?
So different people talk about that. I believe it is individual. I believe it is. Though it's really hard to say in producing your own salvation. I believe the word is of yourself. And so, yeah, I may have to get back with you on that one.
The Greek word there goes back to himself or herself.
It does, but what he's saying is, could of yourselves refer to the collective as a whole, the Philippian congregation. In which, if it is, then I guess really that doesn't change that much, though, because he's still calling upon the individuals within the congregation.
The point, I guess, is starting in verse 12 and even farther up than that, he's talking to the group. He's not talking to any specific individual.
True.
He's talking to the group. So if you continue that thought, when it gets to own salvation, even though we individually have to work out our own salvation with the work that we do, collectively, we as a congregation, by relying upon each other and working together, work out our salvation. If that makes sense.
Yes, yes.
Even though you can use it as singular, it's the group that he's talking about. If he was talking strictly to individuals, then you would have a responsibility, yes, to work out yours, but then that's where your responsibility should stop. It does not stop at you. Your responsibility is then to the rest of us, just like my responsibility is to the rest.
And okay, I believe that's an appropriate distinction to make. Did everybody hear that? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the distinction you're making is he is addressing the collective. He is addressing the Philippian congregation as a whole. And the way he's using it is the way the congregation is to treat one another, and that is the practical application of what he's going to go on to say. But by way of extension, by addressing the congregation as a whole, so too he also addresses the individuals within the congregation for their own personal responsibility, which is very consistent with the way he does so in the rest of the letter.
You think in verse 12, going a little farther with it, it says, "Wherefore, my beloved," and that's like I'm talking to someone in particular, Epaphroditus, or in chapter 2, he's sending this letter to the congregation through him. So do you think when he says, "My beloved," is he talking directly to Epaphroditus in this case?
I'm going to say probably not in this particular case, because he is making the practical application off of the previous section, and he doesn't make any particular indication that he's addressing a particular individual. And I believe beloved is plural, or even if it is singular, my beloved, I believe, for instance, John does the same thing. When he says my little children, and he'll even say my beloved in 1 John, he's addressing the group of people there, not just a singular individual. So you see that word used that way quite often.
Normally, if Paul's going to talk to an individual, he'll point it out.
That's what I would argue. And so, yeah. Like, for instance, later in 4:2, he's going to talk about Euodia and Syntyche in particular. He's going to call their names out, which is a little direct, but it gets his point across. Yes. Sure.
Work out, your mind says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Salvation in this, I'm not sitting here looking at the Greek, so it might be a small disadvantage. Salvation is something that's happened, and it's continual. Your word was production or working out. So it's not just a one and done thing. It's something that's expected to continue to grow, right? And the responsibility is for each of us. It might be easy for me to get lost in the, well, we're doing this and this is just where we're at. Wherever we are at as a church does
I think that's an appropriate implication of the passage, to where by addressing the collective, certainly the individual does need to think about his own personal salvation, in that it is not just a one and done. And I would argue that's probably the way that he's using it here, because he is talking to Christians, people who've already received salvation from God. But salvation is not just something you receive, it's something you do, as he's pointing out here. And so really, that's why I think the idea of keeping yourself in that saved state is probably one of the best ways to word it, even if that's not exactly what I'm trying to convey. But certainly there is, I think what you're getting at is there an accountability to your other Christians within that group in working with them? Is that kind of where you're getting at? Okay. Sure. And that's in thinking about the complaining and disputing, in particular, that's going to be very prevalent, how you treat your brethren. That's going to be the specific manifestation of how the Philippians keep themselves in that safe state. And I'll be honest, I do think the phrase here is more difficult than people give it credit for. And so if I'm wrong, I mean, the word does mean produce, but as far as what that actually means in significance and how that ought to be applied, still something I'm trying to get a tighter grasp on. This is just where I'm currently at in my study as far as how he's using the words produce your own salvation, and whether or not that's an individual as a collective thing, or whether or not that applies to the individual as a person, and how far that extends.
I guess so let me tell you my concern and see if you can help me work it out.
Okay.
So if I put the production before salvation, then I'm responsible for producing my salvation. That means salvation is of my own effort, and I'm thinking, no, that if I put the production afterwards as a result of, if I'm thinking of salvation produces my, you see what I'm saying?
Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. That's kind of where I'm heading. Yeah. But that's good, because that is where we're going to go in a second. Okay. Let me finish out the rest of this section and its wording, and then we'll go back and deal with it within its practical and illustrative concepts. He says, work out your own salvation, produce your own salvation with fear and trembling. This is a common phrase you see in the New Testament, fear and trembling. You see it in 1 Corinthians 2:13, 7:15, Ephesians 6:5. And I believe it's emotional reverence or emotional terror and bodily response. So emotion and then the physical shaking of the knees. That's kind of what's being brought here. And I believe the image of the previous image in 9 through 11 is very prevalent here. Bowing your knees to Christ, and how that is going to be the ultimate eschatological end of those bowing their knees to Christ. And so maybe that's the image you have here, and what it means to bow before God and to serve him with fear and with reverence. For it is God who works in you. Works, energy, that's the word that's used here. God is the one who energizes the work, both to will and to do for his good pleasure. To will, to yearn for in the heart, the mind's deliberation. To do, same word for energy. So God provides the energy for you to will and to give the energy to work for his good pleasure. Same word that's rendered in 1:15 as goodwill. The most likely interpretation being it pleases God to work in the Christian. As God provides the ability for the Christian to work, that pleases him when they respond in faithfulness. And this is probably something that will, because our time's running short, this is probably something that will come up more next week, but you notice in this section just how many pairs are being used here. Look at this. You have fear and trembling, to will and to do, complaining and disputing, blameless and harmless, crooked and perverse, sacrifice and service, run in vain or labored in vain, glad and rejoice, glad and rejoice. You see all those pairs? And really, what he's, I believe, in doing that, he's actually emphasizing the theme of unity a little bit and how these two things work together. And you'll notice that the two words are always connected with each other. And I believe the second word is always very connected to the first word. And so, in this case, when he says both to will and to do, they're connected to each other, though slightly different. And then whenever he's going to talk, this is mostly going to come into effect with complaining and disputing. There are different elements of. We'll flesh it out more. Just notice the pair theme. Okay. Okay, so this is getting to where Dan was talking about. Does man produce his own salvation? And I think it's important to note the distinctions, because whether or not he's addressing it as a collective, or whether or not, or he's addressing it as an individual, or whether or not salvation is, whether or not man becomes saved, they're added to the church, and then they're working to demonstrate that, or if one has to work in order to be saved, those are two separate things, surely, but they do both still involve labor, and that's one of the words that you see consistently throughout this section. So let's define what we mean a little bit. It seems like Paul is affirming two complete opposites. Salvation is entirely man's responsibility, but then in the next verse he says, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. So salvation is entirely God's responsibility. You see the same thing in Ephesians 2, 8 through 10. For by grace you have been saved through faith. It is not of works, lest any man should boast. Then in the next verse he's like, for man was created for his own workmanship. And so you have these two basically opposite things, and they're affirmed. And I think that might be the point. Both of these things contribute, and neither is negated, yet they both still stand as true. If a man desires a paycheck, two things are involved: a job to work at and the effort he puts in while on the job. If a man has no job, does he get paid? I'm going to ask a series of questions here. If a man has no job, does he get paid? No. If a man has a job but chooses not to work, will he get paid? If a man has a job and chooses to work, will he get paid? In the real world, we use this analogy all the time. It makes perfect sense. But then when it comes to religion, all of a sudden things now get kind of fuzzy. If God never sent Jesus and never spoke a word to man, will man be saved? If God did send Jesus and did communicate his commandments, but man disobeyed, will man be saved? If God did send Jesus and did communicate his commandments, and man obeyed, will man be saved? I've heard a disdain for this thinking before, because I've heard it equated to, well, you just believe that God builds half the bridge and man builds the other half of the bridge, and man has become a contributor in his own salvation. Well, I don't believe that's a fair illustration. I disagree with your illustration. God built the foundation, the post, and laid the planks and the railings. The amount of work that God put into making man's salvation possible, incomprehensible. That's Ephesians 1 through 14. The work of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in man's salvation. That's what the whole book of Romans is about, for crying out loud. How God works in man's salvation. Sorry, spoilers. Man only has to walk across the bridge. I think that's the better illustration. God wills us to work through his message, maybe even his people at his time, provides the will, and he energizes the people to work, and they listen, and their work is energized. The gospel is the power to salvation. Sound familiar? And this is for God's goodwill. It makes God happy when his word is listened to and when people are obedient. And so, in clarifying, does man have a role in his own salvation? I would say yes. Did he do anything to deserve that salvation? No. Notice Paul's argument. Work out your salvation because. From the word beloved, we have a relationship. You can trust me when I say you need to work on this. Work out your salvation because you've done great so far. You know what it's like to be obedient, though there may be a challenge now. Work out your own salvation because God has given you everything you need. He sent his Son. And that's what the previous section's all about. Work out your own salvation because God is pleased and glorified when you do so. Why is this so often misunderstood in the religious world today? Where the idea of man making some contribution to his salvation is directly opposed, and seemingly by 90% of the commentators I read.
That's a really good question. And, this has been worked out. So if you think all you got to do is believe to be saved because you can't work, because work cannot be associated with salvation, you've misunderstood Ephesians 2:8 and 9, because Ephesians 2:8 and 9 is talking about works of merit versus works of faith as a response of faith. So you can work out your salvation as a response of faithful, obedient response. You know, the big argument that there's churches right here in our community that have bought into that whole idea that work has nothing to do with our salvation. Therefore, we have no responsibility in anything. Paul's not saying that, so you pointed that out. And that's why James says faith without works is dead. And if you talk to people that believe that, they call James the straw pussy, meaning he didn't really have validity in what he was talking about because they don't understand the difference.
Right.
Between, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I believe both. I don't want to get into James right now, but yeah, that's pretty much what he's talking about. And so I suppose the final distinction is on what distinguishes a works-based salvation and then what Paul warns about in other places. He kind of hinted it, works of merit versus works of obedience. Biblical salvation recognizes that God made it possible and that they put their trust in him. But meritorious works that believe that man alone is providing for his salvation. Biblical salvation has the guarantee of the blood of Jesus to wash man's mistakes away, but meritorious works requires absolute perfection from man. I believe both are necessary.
Is the same Greek word used for work in 12, I think it is, and then when it gets down there in 13, it talks about God who is at work. Is that the same root word in the Greek?
Which word are you referring to?
In 12, where it says work out your own salvation, talk about what the human has to do.
Yes.
And then in 13, where it talks about God who is at work.
Those are two different words. Now, effectively, they'll mean something very close to the same thing. because we talked about how that means, in verse 12, means produce. Work means labor. Very close, I think labor is more emphasized. But as you're going to notice, we're going to have a lot of words that have to do with the idea of work, especially as we continue and analyze the next couple of words. And so even if the little nuances are different, the theme of labor persists throughout the whole section. And that's the direct reflection of what Christ did to the Father in his obedience in verses 5 through 8. Good thoughts, everyone. I appreciate your contribution. You are